Pat, thank you for inviting me again this afternoon to have this conversation with you. And for those of you that are joining us this afternoon, this is a third in a three-part series on board governance. And so if this is your first webinar to join us on, be sure to go back and check out the earlier two. One was on recruiting and selecting board members. The second one was on orienting and evaluating board members. And today we're going to talk about critical conversations on critical relationships that the board needs to manage. And we'll talk about it collectively as a board. But then there'll be various constituents, if you will, so that certainly the board chair has certain responsibilities as with committee chairs. So we may do some of those nuances, but then we'll just dive right in and talk about all the different pieces that a board is responsible for.
Good.
And as part of that, Pat, I think to set context again, I think we probably need to make sure we understand the board's role, and I tend to define it this way, and tell me if it's anywhere close to accurate. You're the guru here, Pat, and thanks for investing in my life over the years, but I tend to think of board as they're responsible for governance, and the CEO and the C-suite, or the president and his cabinet, or the executive director and the directors, and I like to keep those nuances of titles together. The CEO is responsible for the execution and the management of the organization. So there's governance versus management, and they really connect through the linkage of, I would simplify it as the chair of the board and the CEO have to work hand in glove. But then there's the board, and then there's the C-suite, if you will. So there's a broader teams that they work together with, but the linkage is the board and the CEO, but specifically a lot of times there's these pre-meeting and post-meeting calls and conversations and emails between the chairman and the CEO. But before we go there, that's kind of where we're headed. Talk to me a little bit more about governance versus management. And do you see it the same way? Between the board and governance and the CEO and his leadership team or her leadership team and the management of the organization?
For the most part, yes.
Well, I'm surprised it wasn't depend. It depends.
Well, as we've talked about in other conversations, the answer to any question about governance is it depends. You're never going to get in trouble with that, and it's a true answer. But I agree to your point. The board is responsible for governance, and management is responsible for management. Here's the challenge. What's governance and what's management? And so when I ask that of individuals, I hear, well, management, the board makes the decisions and management implements them. Oh, that's good. Well, does management make decisions? Yes. How many decisions do they make? A lot of them. What decisions do they make? That's the key. What decisions does the board make, and what decisions does management make? And so it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
The shorthand is governance versus management, and we'll live with that.
Yeah.
But we need to understand that it's much more nuanced. It's much more detailed than that. It's really primarily what decisions does the board make and what do they delegate to management for them to make. The board can do anything it wants. It's the ultimate authority. But they delegate that authority, a good portion of it, to management. So that said, I would agree.
Yeah. So let's unpack that a little bit more, Pat, just maybe for a practical or maybe a next step conversation. We won't go deep on it. We don't have time today. But certainly, we've talked about this in other conversations. There's this concept of policy governance that helps really articulate the board's role of strategic planning, responsibility for the organization, its purpose, vision, mission. But then as part of that, they set policies, if you will, that then management lives within this framework of understanding in theory, and that allows there to be a little bit more distinction. And and I would agree it's nuanced, but sometimes, obviously management has to make certain policies or they adopt certain policies, especially if it has to do with compliance with regulations that, in essence, the board's telling management you have to abide by compliance regulations and policies set by various, judicial or government jurisdictions, if you will, federal, state, local. Take that a little bit further for me, or unpack and maybe refine what I just was trying to articulate.
I might get in trouble for saying this, but policies are like decision-making.
Yeah?
What policies does the board make, and what policies can management make?
Yeah?
Certain advocates out there that talk about policy governance.
Yep.
Well, that term's been around for a very long time because boards do make policy,
Right?
but so does management.
Right.
And policy are just pre-made decisions or guidelines.
Guidelines.
One way to see it would be this. I don't know if this shows up on camera, but we're sitting at a table that's a big circle. Pretend like this circle is the organization. It's like a bowl, nestled bowls. This is the top, this is the biggest bowl. The board owns that. Inside this outer circle is another circle. The board delegates what that is in that circle to the CEO or executive director.
Yep.
If there's a high trust relationship between the board and the executive director, they're convinced that he or she is competent and committed, they're seasoned and experienced, that circle on the inside will be very close to the circle on the outside. Otherwise, the board's very tired because they're doing a lot of work.
Right.
But if it's a new CEO or the board doesn't have that confidence or there's some conflict, et cetera, that circle gets smaller. In other words, the board delegates fewer things.
They get
fewer
more involved
policies,
in
fewer
managing
decisions.
the transition.
That's correct. Inside that circle is another circle. A CEO is going to give some things to the CFO, the head of HR, et cetera. But the board owns the big circle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Decisions are made, policies are made, strategies and objectives are made. People say, well, what about the mission and the vision? Well, the board owns those. They approve them and they approve of changes, but very often it comes to them through the offices of management that has the time to yell and scream and debate and reflect and pray and dream together.
And they're experiencing the impact of those, or the
Absolutely.
shifts in culture or effectiveness.
That's right. And they bring it to the board, and the board will discuss it.
Right.
And their fingerprints will be all over it.
Exactly.
Ultimately, they'll come to some consensus and approve it, but it's the board's to approve.
Yeah. So what I love is that we're both saying the same thing, and ultimately what I'm hearing is two things. One is there has to be a high level of trust, which is where we're going in this conversation.
Oh boy, yes, they do.
And number two, there has to be clarity in communication and understanding. Because
Crystal clarity.
if you violate one or the other, it impacts the other. There is a strong correlation, and if I miscommunicate, something's going to happen, and then it'll cause you to not trust me based on a miscommunication or lack of clarity.
Very committed, very, very connected. The axiom is that the first victim of low trust is communication.
Yeah.
I will not be transparent in my communication with someone I do not trust.
Yep. Okay. Great. So now we've established kind of the roles, if you will, and we see how critical these relationships are to being effective. So let's talk about some of the stakeholders or some of the interested parties. And again, because we're focusing on the board at this point, maybe we'll come back someday and talk about, the CEO and the executive director. But since this is a board governance series, what are some of the stakeholders that we need to think about that as a board collectively when we're in session, or maybe more specifically, I'm willing to go into the conversation about the board chair, because a lot of times that board chair, by definition and title, has agreed to additional responsibilities and time commitment to these outside of meetings that need to take place as far as strategy and lining up activities for the board to some degree. And so, ultimately, it's the board responsibility, but that board chair is kind of the point of the spear, or the first among equals, if you will.
Can I disagree with that?
Only if you want to.
Okay.
Only, Pat, if you want to be wrong, go ahead and disagree with it.
Well, that has happened before. And I remember when I said we made a profit this month, and you said, I don't think so. The accountant won. But I'm nervous about the chairman being first among equals.
Okay.
We got to be clear the fact that the CEO reports to the board. Period.
Correct.
New paragraph.
Yep.
I'll come back to the connection there. The board does not report to the CEO or to the chairman.
Yep.
He or she is equal to every board member sitting around the table. Now, first among equals communicates some little bit of hierarchy. So it's not wrong totally, but to some people, it's going to give the wrong signal.
Misunderstood.
And so as long as we understand that the chairman, in some circumstances, is the delegated representative of the board to interface primarily with the
CEO
CEO,
or executive director.
and that he or she is doing it on behalf of the board,
Yep.
and they're communicating the board mindset, the board wishes, the board policies and decisions to the CEO, and vice versa, the linking pin. That CEO is the linking pin for the board and the rest of the organization. So that said, we'd be in agreement.
Yeah. So, and I love the clarity, Pat. I really do. That helps me think about this a little bit differently, because I do agree with you. And I think what happened is I ended up leaning into my experiences.
Yeah.
Where the reality is most board chairmen do see themselves as the first among equal, and the fact that they take more responsibility, more initiative, and more engagement, whether they intend for it to come across that way or whether the board, but a lot of times board members will defer to the board chair versus understanding that no, the board has delegated responsibility to the board chair. And in many ways, there's a biblical concept here as well, that the board chair is serving the board.
Yes, and leading the board,
And
really,
leading the board at the same time.
as
So
a
it's that
shepherd leads the flock.
servant leadership,
Yeah.
again, from that biblical
Yes.
concept of understanding the role with more clarity.
Yes.
So really appreciate you bringing that nuance into the conversation, because that's critical as we step into the next piece of how does the board and its delegated leadership engage with the various stakeholders or those interested parties. And we will differentiate those differently as we go through this conversation.
Right. Well, we've talked about this a little bit before offline. One thing that I find that's important to make a distinction when I'm overseas, that we're talking about, for a not-for-profit, stakeholders, not shareholders.
Right.
Shareholders really is another word for owners, and they reside in the corporate world.
Right.
Stakeholders is not about ownership, but stakeholders have a stake in the organization. They have an interest in its mission and its outcomes. It's important to them. So every not-for-profit has stakeholders. And we can put those stakeholders in two groups. In fact, I'll use my circle of the table. We've got internal stakeholders. Management would be one. Employees would be another one.
Donors would be another one.
Well, they could be either external or internal, but regardless,
Right.
they're internal in your definition. On the outside of the circle, we have the government, who's generally very passive to us as a not-for-profit organization unless we mess up, and then they get extremely active and energized.
They do.
And but they provide our certification, allow us to be a nonprofit, and they can withdraw it at a drop of a hat. We've got the constituents that we serve are outside that circle. That's another stakeholder. The general public, media. I would throw donors in there.
Yeah.
So volunteers, um, other ministries with whom we partner. So there's a group of stakeholders exterior to the entity, this organization we call our non-for-profit, not-for-profit. However, they have a stake in it. They're interested in us to one degree or another. Some positively interested, some negatively, and some passive. Does that make sense?
It does. Makes a world of sense.
Any entity, not for profit, that does not pay attention to those stakeholders and identify who they are, who's important, why they're important, and what are their expectations, is incurring some risk.
Yeah.
The board, in their governance responsibilities, needs to ensure the ministry is aware and can answer those questions. Who are our stakeholders? What are their expectations? How do we know that? Are we meeting those expectations? How do we know that? And the ones that are, the relationships are a little bit stressed or strained, do we have a strategy for mitigation or strengthening that relationship? The board may stick its nose under that tent a bit to help, but in generally, they're going to delegate that to the management team and the organization.
Yeah.
But the board will monitor it. They'll
Right.
keep their fingers on the pulse. And they will expect management to report on it periodically, depending on the nature, the relationship, and the importance of that exterior stakeholder. That also goes for interior ones. You know, tell us about our employees. Are they happy? Have we done an attitude climate survey? Are they engaged? Are they paid appropriately? Do we have leadership development?
Yeah.
Et cetera.
So again, these are all board responsibilities from a governance perspective. And then they delegate it through the linkage to the CEO, who has a C-suite of people reporting to him, or the executive director, president of the cabinet. And in these cases, compliance with government regulations many times falls, for example, to the CFO and maybe HR with Department of Labor, et cetera. And there's compliance there with reporting, if you're a not-for-profit, with your 990.
Yeah.
Depending on the state that you're in, compliance with an audit or a financial statement review.
True.
Based on your state guidelines. And so the board delegates these, but at the end of the day, the board still has responsibility. And so an effective board mitigating these risks will have an audit/finance committee who's actually responsible for hiring the audit firm to do the independent financial statement audit. Management may be the ones doing all the work, but the auditors are reporting back to the board.
That's exactly right, Stan. That's one of those nuances.
Yeah.
An outsider looking and not knowing anything would say that the auditor is working for and reporting to the management team, when in fact they're working with the management team hand in glove, day in, day out, but ultimately have a reporting relationship with the board.
And so I'm going to pick on us auditor, or not auditors. I'm not smart enough to be an auditor, Pat. Everybody knows that. But having served as a CFO of different global ministries and organizations, certainly, what you're saying is absolutely correct, that the CFO is then the responsibility from the board goes to the CEO, who then delegates it to the CFO. And at the end of the day, if the CFO is not doing his job, the board wants to jump in and do something about it.
We probably will tell the CEO to do something about it.
Exactly, and that becomes the critical relationship that they have bound themselves by their own policy to say the linkage goes through the CEO, and they hold the CEO accountable for the CEO's staff.
Correct.
And so that becomes a really important part, and I'm going to introduce a concept that you taught me, Pat, the whole concept of the RACI chart of responsibility, accountability, consulting, and informing. And the idea there being the CEO really is responsible for hiring their team. A wise CEO will consult with the board on the team members so that there's good communication, that trust and communication, because we started out with those are, kind of two sides of the same coin, are so critical in this managing relationships. And then ultimately, if there's an issue, the CEO may go to the board and say, I've got an issue with my CFO. I need to make a decision, but you're informing the board before you take action, recognizing it's my decision to
for
make.
counsel.
Exactly. So again, that's just an example of critical relationships. And again, I picked on us CFOs. I picked on me because I'm safe to do that. I don't want to pick on other areas, but certainly this would apply to any area in any not-for-profit, whether it's in a church, higher education, international ministry, when you're out of compliance, or a particular leader within an organization internally is not doing their job. The board is limited to consulting with the CEO and give their insights or observations and or provide counsel as requested. Is that a fair statement?
I think so, Stan. Now, in the corporate world, it's not unusual for the policy of the board to be that the board must approve the CEO's direct hires and fires.
Yeah.
Now, I see that also a lot in the not-for-profit world, but not all. It would not be a wise board to overrule a CEO unless they felt very clear and strongly about it. On either side, the firing or the hiring, their job really would be counseling. Have you considered, have you thought, here's some risks, here's my experience on it, let's talk about it, let's pray about it, let's think about it. But certainly the board would be engaged, and it's a high trust, diplomatic, balanced relationship in that respect, a very important one.
So off the record, there'd only be a few hundred people listening to this.
Yeah.
Would you say that if a board is in strong disagreement with the CEO wanting to hire or fire somebody in their C-suite, that their response, if the CEO is not listening, is that maybe they need to deal with the CEO?
That could happen. It depends on the importance of the position.
Did you say depends again?
Yeah, I did.
I love it.
Yeah.
That's always the right answer.
I'm probably not going to get as exercised about the head of quality control as I would the CFO.
Right.
Or the head of HR.
Right.
And it would depend on the degree, the intensity of the negative feelings and the reason for those negative feelings. Yeah. If there were character or competence issues that we felt and were clear, and there was a strong and consensus feeling on the board, we'd toughen up and we'd have a long conversation with the CEO. We'd never reach over the CEO to do it. Whether or not they allow the CEO to go over their objections, thinking, well, this is a lesson he or she needs to learn, we got to wonder, are we willing for the organization to pay the price of that lesson?
Right.
And that depends.
It does. So, yeah, and I'll be a little bit transparent here and try to be a little bit obscure at the same time. I was actually in a position with an organization once upon a time in my life that, I had some serious challenges on the team. And, but kind of the organization's posture, culture was a little bit of what we call mercy hiring, that, people needed a job, so we'd hire them whether they had the competencies or not. And so had a particular person who was not competent in their role and created some challenges for the organization. And I found myself caught as a CFO, COO of an organization. Can I fire this person for cause? Am I allowed to or not? And then I ended up with a little bit of a board tension. Some saying, absolutely, why are you even asking us? And others like, well, no, there's grace and mercy and longevity and loyalty. And ultimately, I did pull the trigger with the CEO's blessing and authority on that. But, again, those are some practical examples where downstream, if the board's not clear and authorizing the CEO to do what needs to be done when they see the evidence of the challenge, but because of a cultural nuance, make it difficult to take the action that's appropriate. It leaves the team with a clouded, clarity of lack of clarity to be decisive. And so that's just one of the things that has always struck me as a board member, or now more as a C-suite kind of a person, that really need to be thoughtful of the clarity of the decisions that need to be made and who makes those, and then but also that trust and communication, so that you don't create a chink in the armor of the relationship.
That's right. You remind me in that story of one more that's similar. It's a metaphor. You've got 3 sons, as I remember
I
right.
do.
I had 2 daughters, and my daughters had permission to tell any guy that asked them out, I really want to go out with you, but my dad won't let you. Won't let me. Or I can't go out this weekend, and so on and so forth. And they exercised that periodically. Not enough, I don't think, but that aside, the board, in some respects, in a high trust relationship, can play the role where the CEO can say, I'd like to do this, but the board's not with me on this.
Yeah.
We're going to have to go another direction. Or I'd like to keep you, but the board's not, etc. So the board can be a tool sometimes in the hands of the CEO as long as they have agreement that they can in this instance.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Comes back to that trust
Trust,
and clear
relationship.
communication.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so we've talked about internal and external stakeholders within critical relationships that need to be managed, at the board level, or at least an understanding of how it's being managed. Certainly, we've talked just now about management. Let's talk a little bit about managing board members and managing themselves, if you will, as a board of directors. Give me some insights on how do we do that effectively as board members?
Well, that wasn't on the list of questions you told me about, so I'm going to have to think for a moment and make up an answer. But well, let's think for a second. We said earlier, the board, being the ultimate authority, is really responsible to make the most complex, important strategic decisions, or ensure they're made one way or the other, and that they're made wisely and well. They're doing this with limited time. If there was ever a clarion call for wisdom, that would be in the board room, particularly of a faith-based not-for-profit.
Yeah.
So thoughts come to my mind. The primary management task of the board is, one, to make sure that we're talking about the right things. That's called the agenda. And at some time we're going to talk about the chairman and the executive director and the board and the role in putting that agenda together, but the quality of that agenda will determine the quality of the meeting if we can execute.
Right.
Let's assume we've got that right. The next task is to ensure the climate of the board meeting room facilitates the brightest collective wisdom or IQ that we can pull together for each of the issues on the agenda. That's why we talk about collegiality so much. That's why we talk about the ability to manage straight talk and debate with collegiality and active listening and the suspension of assumptions. A large part of this falls on the facilitation skills of the chairman. The facilitator of that board meeting needs to be masterful. By the way, that would be one of the attributes we'd look for in a chairman. However, there are some instances that I've seen where the best chairman didn't have that attribute, and he or she chose another board member to be the facilitator. In one case, the chairman said, I need to be a participant in these conversations, and I can't facilitate at the same time. But generally, it's the chairman and their facilitation skills and engaging the board, the non-engaged. Martha, we've not heard your voice on this issue. What are your thoughts? Bill, we've heard a lot of your thoughts today. Let's see what some of the other board members are thinking, et cetera. Yeah. Thirdly, the quickness to prayer when we get stuck. And because of the nature of the issues that are on the boardroom table, if they could have been solved in the field, they would have been. Paul and Barnabas ended up in the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. They would have loved to have solved that problem up in Damascus. It was just too big for them, too complex. They had to take it to the, quote, board.
Right.
because they were stuck. It was too big. When I joined the Crusade board, my very first meeting, Bill Bright, after we were engaged in a bit of we probably weren't 10 minutes, 15 minutes into the meeting, said, let's pray. And I, being a good board member, bowed my head and folded my hands and knelt over the table. But no one said anything. I couldn't hear, and all of a sudden I'm hearing chairs squeak and things, and I did something only a new board member would do. I peeked. And my fellow board members were getting out of their chairs and kneeling in front of their chairs to pray. Everybody was kneeling but me. Well, I quickly got on my knees. I mean, they took it seriously. We probably did that 3 times that day because we got stuck a lot because we were dealing with big issues and we didn't have the answer. So this willingness to pray.
Yeah.
So we're talking about collegiality, we're talking about facilitation, we're talking about prayer. It's all about involving God, finding His will, a high collective IQ, a safe environment to say what I want to say and be myself and not get whacked for it.
Yeah.
Those are some of the things in the boardroom for managing that relationship, a high trust relationship among well-intended colleagues that are spiritually and emotionally mature.
Thank you, Pat. That was fantastic. Let me see if I can interpret this a little bit deeper for application possibly. Absolutely agree that the board has to have a safe environment, culture of trust and clear communication, to have these straight talk, to put the issues on the table and debate them passionately. Mm-hmm. I think one of the key things that you've also taught me is that we have to put guardrails up to keep it from becoming personal.
Yes. Yeah.
No personal attacks.
Right.
It's always the issue, and to some degree, that facilitator has to redirect things to almost a third party out here versus you and I going at it, but we're talking about solving this problem over
Yes,
here.
yeah.
So these some techniques there. Absolutely agree with that. I would also go a little bit further that I would probably, believe it or not, I tend to be passive. People laugh at me, but I say passive. I'm non-confrontational. So if it's fight or flight, it's flight for me. Now I can be real direct, and I'm confident. So that sometimes people misunderstand that as being aggressive. And so there have been times when I have been in a boardroom, or I have been in a boardroom, either on a board or as part of a management team, and I have defaulted and allowed the chairman to manage all of this. And I think as a board member, we all have a responsibility to maintain that safe place for debate. And and early on in the conversation, we talked about, no, it's not just the first among equal. The board has delegated some of these roles to a chairman for facilitation or otherwise. But ultimately, it's a responsibility of every board member
Absolutely.
to
You're so
jump
right.
in, to support, to be a part of, and maybe you are not the facilitator, but you can help the facilitator. You may not be the chair, but you can certainly speak your mind and be self-aware of when you need to speak up and when it's time to, let somebody else speak up. These are all critical relationships that we have to manage. And I think maybe it was in our first conversation weeks ago that we talked about having EQ, emotional quotient, as board members, to be self-aware, to be aware of others. And that comes back to that whole spiritual maturity. And I'll conclude my remarks here by thinking through what you just ended with, which is really how you and I actually started with prayer.
Yeah.
That the reality is that's what makes faith-based organizations
Different.
so powerful.
Yeah.
Because if we lack wisdom, we know where the source is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we don't have to wander around lost or confused or in lack of clarity. We don't have to violate trust.
Yeah.
If we just had the fortitude, and don't wait for the chairman.
Well,
Just say, you know what, it's time to pray. And I have loved being part of board meetings when we realize we're stuck
Yeah.
and we pause for prayer.
Yeah.
And sometimes the answer doesn't come immediately,
No.
but the relationships are maintained and the trust is strengthened because we realize this is bigger than we have and it may take more time. But at some point, we do get more clarity, at least on the next step, if it's not the solution. And so as I'm wrapping up our talking together, and again, Pat, you are an incredible wealth of knowledge, and I'm so thankful for the investments you've made over the 17 lessons and the probably hundreds of hours of content that's available that we'll certainly make sure everybody's aware of and how to get access to it. And thank you for investing in my life and helping me to grow in this area as well as board governance and management techniques and whatnot. But I am just so grateful that the fact is that as a board member, we don't have to be perfect.
No.
There are no perfect board members. We're all human. And at the end of the day, what we're looking for is God's favor, his insight. We want to be servant leaders. We want to aspire to serving the organization well, this duty of loyalty. Other closing comments for us on
Well, I totally agree with what you just said. What a gift that we have the confidence that we can go before the throne.
Absolutely.
And your earlier point, facilitation is a team sport. Yeah. And we've got to have the freedom to speak up and raise our hand. I totally agree with that's a great summary, Stan.
So Pat, closing comments. You're a board member, maybe two. You're a board member. What's the one thing you would want a new board member to know? Generically. Obviously, it's going to be different for every organization, but one golden nugget.
I would want them to know two things. I would want them to know the mission of the organization down to its DNA level. I'm not talking about the mission statement.
Yeah.
Often that fails.
It doesn't pass the Snicker test.
To clearly say, why are we in existence as an organization? Why did God call us in?
Yeah.
That would be number one. Because number two, I would want them to see themselves as a steward of that mission.
Yeah.
It's like this. God has put this in our possession. We're stewards. We don't own it.
Yeah.
We'll act like owners, but we know that it belongs to the master. And we've got to give him a return on investment. In the not-for-profit, faith-based world, that's not money. That's changed lives and ministry impact.
Yeah.
Those two things, to know and be committed and aligned to that mission, but to really know it, and to see him or herself as a steward of that mission, and making all of their deliberations and decisions about the advancing of that mission would be what I would want them to know.
Second question. What question would you recommend that every potential board member that's being recruited, that's being asked to consider a slot, what questions should they be asking? Or what should they, whether it's asking the organization or asking themselves, what is the one question they need to be asking about the invitation to join a board?
I'm gonna give you a little bit of a different answer than you might expect, because you might be expecting some really deep, strategic, penetrating concept, but that's not what
I
I'm
know
gonna
the
give
answer.
you. Oh.
It depends.
No, but it does depend. I would say that a thoughtful person would say, I've enjoyed hearing about the organization. I'm excited about your mission. I need to think about it and pray about it, but I want to be really clear about one thing. What are the expectations of North Star Ministries
Yep.
for their board members? What are my responsibilities, and what are your expectations for each board member in playing out their role? What's the role, the job description of a board member? If that's a murky answer, I'd either extend my prayer time or look for another ministry.
Yeah.
But I would look for clarity, and that allows me to ask, can I do this? Do I have the time? And based on the mission, am I willing? Do I feel called? but I've got to have that answer first.
That's exactly what I was looking for, Pat. I was going to oversimplify it and over spiritualize it. Is God calling you to do this? But it's hard to know if God's calling you without what you just shared.
Unless you know what
You've
this
got to
is.
know. Can I do this? Do I
Yeah.
have the time? Do I have the skill? Am I passionate about this? Is God calling me to do this? So as we wrap up our time, the reality is board membership, whether you're being recruited, you're on the board, or you may be at the end of your term, is a lot like being on a relay race team. It really is a stewardship responsibility. And that organization that you're helping to lead as a board member and you're stewarding is like the baton.
Yeah.
And you hold on to that baton. And what we see a lot of failures, we tend to think about this in terms of the CEO or the president, but it actually affects the board members as well. If you don't grasp that baton firmly when it's your turn to step up as a board member, and if you don't let go of it when you've run your lap, the organization can be impacted,
Yeah.
maybe disqualified. Certainly there's just challenges that go with dropping the baton, not handing it off smoothly, not running with it confidently, not releasing it graciously. And so again, Pat, thank you for investing time. Thank you for allowing me to come over and visit with you multiple times to be a part of this. And thank you for your investment in the kingdom and for using what God's given you as your wisdom, your discernment, your skill, your experiences to share with so many of our clients that are serving the kingdom around the world. So thank you, Pat.
You're welcome. You're very gracious. I'd like to get that list so I can share it with my family.
Thank you again for joining us. This actually concludes our third in the series. And if you've missed the first two, you can go to our website and get the three board governance webinars that we've had with Pat McMillan. Thank you again, Pat, for joining us.
Thanks, Dan.
And we'll see you on our next webinar.